Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Amanda, and I'm so glad to see you all here today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, whether it's to just drop in today or to join us in our sessions throughout the day at Clary as well. Today's symposium brings us together around the timely question of AI, teaching, learning, assessment, and academic integrity. Across the day, we'll hear from colleagues and guest speakers who are thinking carefully about generative AI and how it's reshaping higher education, and how we can respond thoughtfully, critically, and ethically. We have a full and exciting schedule ahead, including our keynote speaker, which we'll get to shortly, several workshops, and some engaging conversations throughout the day. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that St. Mary's University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We acknowledge them as past, present, and future caretakers of this land, and we are grateful to live, learn, and work in this territory. As we gather today in a space of learning and dialogue, I invite us to reflect on our responsibility to one another, to this place, and to the ongoing work of reconciliation in higher education. Now, a few thank yous. Thank you to Mount St. Vincent University for collaborating with us on this great symposium and this great topic. We'd also like to thank the SMU alumni and QP 3912 for kindly supporting the refreshments and lunches today and sponsoring us in those. So thank you to them. And so if you haven't gotten any coffee, there's some in the back. And one final thing before we get started. No, we're technically started. We are recording this session. The Q&A won't be recorded, and that will be at a later time after the session when we move to Clary, AT 340. But at the end, I'll have a little reminder as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a leading voice in the field of academic integrity and ethics in education. Dr. Sarah Eaton is a professor, research chair, writer, and speaker based at the University of Calgary's Workland School of Education. Her work focuses on academic integrity, ethics, and the evolving role of technology, particularly in artificial intelligence. She's a leading advocate for ethical practices in teaching and research and has written and presented extensively on issues such as plagiarism, misconduct, and integrity in higher education. Dr. Eaton also serves as editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Educational Integrity and leads the Postplagiarism Research Lab, where she explores the intersection of technology and ethical scholarship. The rapid rise of AI tools has prompted educators to revisit some of these most fundamental questions we ask about assessment. What are we measuring? How are we learning? And how is learning taking place? And how is academic integrity and pedagogy intersecting in this new environment? In today's session, the keynote address, The Assessment Reckoning, Practical Pathways Forward in Post-Plagiarism Era, Dr. Eaton will help us think through how generative AI is reshaping reassessment design in higher education and what that means for institutional policy and classroom practice. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Sarah Eaton.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Amanda, but you forgot the most important part, that I'm a Santa Marian, and I graduated from SMU. And like so many people from the Maritimes, I went west, and it has taken me an awfully long time to come home. But I feel very welcome. Campus has changed a lot, but seeing that admin building on Roby Street was a real warmth to my heart this morning. So thanks for the invitation to come back and join you all today. So in less time than it takes me to deliver the talk today, artificial intelligence will generate more academic level text than all the world's scholars in the past decade. How we respond to this moment will define the future of higher education. I have no idea if that statement is true, but ChatGPT told me it was a good cold opening. We have no way to empirically prove that, but being educators today, we can imagine that it could be plausible to use the language of Mythbusters. So in our time together today, I'll spend a little bit of time setting the stage, talking about academic integrity scholarship. That's what I am basically, a plagiarism scholar, having graduated from English here. I would never have imagined that my life would take me down this path, but here we are. So studying plagiarism led to studying academic integrity, and then some of the research that we're doing in terms of artificial intelligence and academic integrity. So we'll look at some of the research, and then we'll look at some evidence-informed recommendations for assessment. But I'd like to start, as I mentioned, by setting the stage and mainly talking about how I don't have all the answers. So if anybody comes to you and tells you that they have the silver bullet, please run, because we're all in the same boat, trying to figure this out as we go along. Super complex questions. Most of us never anticipated we would be teaching in a time with AI, starting with things like large language models and now with agentic AI. Educators all over the world are concerned with these questions, so you're not alone. They don't have answers today, this week, or this year, but we know that we're being called upon to provide responses. So basically, I'm in the same boat as the rest of you. I actively teach and supervise graduate students, and I've been revising my own assessments as we go, and I will revise them again this year, because last year I didn't know about agentic AI, and now I do. So that changes everything again. But first, let me just sort of talk a little bit about academic integrity and some vocabulary and getting our vocabulary straight. So this was a continuum that I put together with some students during COVID-19. One of my pet peeves as an academic integrity scholar is when people say, I'm dealing with a case of integrity, or I'm investigating integrity. I'd like to suggest that we don't deal with integrity or investigate it, but rather that we should celebrate it. That's what we're here to do, is to promote ethical learning with our students. So at one end of this continuum, we have academic integrity and ethical decision-making, which we know is cultivated through regular practice, education, skill building. And at the other end, we have breaches of integrity, violations of integrity, and academic misconduct. We can call it what it is, and we don't have to use whitewashing language when we talk about academic cheating. In the middle of this continuum, as educators, there's that moment when we suspect or know that something's gone wrong. I call that the holy shit moment. What do I do now? Is there a policy? Do I talk to someone? Do I deal with this by myself? And I know that you have policies and procedures here at SMU. Most universities do, but particularly for early career researchers, those who are precariously employed, may not be part of the academic culture at the institution. They may not know what to do. If they're pre-tenure, they may be told what not to do, not to report it, not to rock the boat. And they're recognizing that there's a lot of emotional labor when it comes to suspicions of cheating. What do I do? And will I ruin the student's future if I report them? Can I handle it by myself? So all of these questions are normal. As we become more seasoned, we understand what the expectations are, who to talk to, how to deal with it. But certainly in the first years of a career, it can be very unsettling. And I've experienced it myself, the anger and distrust I feel when I know that a student has cheated, and it breaks the relationship with my students. So I've been in that boat myself, and recognizing that as an educator, that's a pivotal moment for us and a lot of uncertainty. So that's why we put the gray zone in there. And then once we've reported it, presumably we pass it over to an investigator who then handles the case and makes a decision. Hopefully, as an educator, we're informed of the outcome of the decision. It doesn't happen at every university. At our university, for example, often the classroom instructor is not informed of the outcome. And it's something that I think would be in support of relationality with the students if we were at least told, yes, an outcome has been reached and a grade reduction or some other penalty that's outlined in the policy and procedures has been applied. That little bit of closure can go a long way. Nevertheless, if you're in a position here where you're not told, you're also not alone. One of the projects that I had a chance to work on in recent years was a handbook of academic integrity. It's considered a major reference work in the field. Came out in 2024, 3 volumes, 2,000 pages, 145 contributors. I'm going to summarize it for you so you don't have to read it. As I was reading those chapters, what came through for me was I wanted to find a through line for all of them. And at first there wasn't one. And I sat with it, and this framework around comprehensive academic integrity emerged. I have to give credit to a colleague at the University of British Columbia, Kieran Ford. He calls this the colorful swirly donut of integrity. I'm waiting for Tim Hortons to bring out their donut. Hasn't happened yet. But I'll take you through the swirls, as Kieran calls them, so that you can sort of see where we are. We'll start with the amber swirl on the right-hand side, student academic conduct. This is what we all classically know as academic integrity: plagiarism, exam cheating, outsourcing, term papers, cheating on assignments, etc. We also know that as students gain more experience in undergraduate research programs, and graduate students are also taking more hands-on roles of their own in doing research, publications, a PhD by publication, for example, our students get more experience than generations past with research ethics and also research integrity and publication ethics. Before, these were the domain of us professors. This for me is a real gray area with students. If a student's working in a research lab with a professor or graduate student, or they're working with a group to publish a paper and they notice misconduct, what does the student do? Most of our policies and procedures, as I understand them, have student conduct policies and then research integrity policies, but grad students and postdocs are often left in the middle and not knowing what to do, especially if they're in a power relationship when they see misconduct happening. And then there's the bright yellow swirl, which is where we are today around instructional ethics and what does it mean to assess students ethically. In the age of ChatGPT, one of the things I've seen is what's called now white texting, and where an instructor will have an assignment in Word format, for example, and say it's a chemistry assignment, and somewhere in that assignment they will write instructions about panda bears dancing, and then they will take that text and take it from black to white so that the student doesn't see it on their screen. But if the student cuts and pastes the text, puts it into ChatGPT and says, answer this question on my assignment, ChatGPT doesn't recognize the font color and will produce an answer about panda bears dancing. This is what we would call in my world covert assessment. And when we've had professors at our university try and call students up on misconduct after having used that tactic, the cases are dismissed on the premise that the instructor was not acting ethically. So does it mean that the student also wasn't acting ethically? It's another question, but there is an expectation more and more of ethical assessment of student work, and figuring out what that is part of the big conundrum. So this all takes us up to institutional leadership, where students today are expecting their institutional leaders to act with integrity. Certainly during COVID-19 and geopolitical events that we've had, when students see professors or administrators whitewashing certain topics, not wanting to talk about certain topics, or not handling situations in ways that students think could be handled better, they see that as a breach of integrity. And all of this taking us around to everyday ethics and collegial and professional ethics, basically academic integrity as a foundation for ethical decision-making in life and in the workplace. Needless to say, these are our perceptions of academic integrity are changing and shifting beyond what is historically only student conduct. That still remains a part of it, but has expanded. So if you only think of academic integrity as student conduct, I would encourage you to expand what your understanding of it is. Certainly there are frameworks to do this. One of them is from the International Center for Academic Integrity. They have fundamental values: courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. Frameworks like this provide a positive foundation to talk to students about academic integrity, what it is, and to start conversations with them about what does it mean to you to learn ethically. But students may have other responsibilities. For example, when it comes to sharing in peer groups, they may find social pressures to share and help fellow students in ways that might not be considered congruous with academic integrity policies. And this idea of helping or sharing can mean social exclusion if a student doesn't do it. So students may be sort of caught in value systems of institutions of what we want students to do, right? Typically when we think of responsibility and academic integrity, we would say it's the student's responsibility to know the policies, to act honestly, and what do they do when they're also caught in these situations where they are expected to help their peers. And sometimes when I bring up this example, I've had colleagues challenge me and say, yes, international students in particular are expected to help their peers. But there is a good amount of research to show that domestic students are caught in the same trap and have been for a long time. There's newspaper reports going back about 100 years that talk about students in fraternities and sororities, and a pejorative term called frat files, meaning the files that were kept historically in old photocopy paper boxes, remember those? But the idea was that you would put tests and exams in there to help fellow members understand the expectations and provide models or examples to work from. Now, I don't offer that example in any way to speak pejoratively about Greek societies because I know that they also do a lot of good, but merely to say that the idea of students under pressure to share with their peers is not new, and it is not limited to international students. So thinking about the ways in which students are caught within value frameworks can be a useful point of departure for these conversations. But this value framework is just one. It's based out of an organization in the United States. And a couple of years ago, while working on this handbook, I had a chance to work with an American colleague and think about the differences between American and Canadian perceptions or understandings of academic integrity. And so what came out of that conversation was, to my surprise, to know that Americans may have a polarized view on this issue. In one camp, there are individuals who believe that academic integrity is about moral code and character development. Good people don't cheat. And if we just cultivate your moral character, you won't make poor decisions. And on the other side, there's a different camp who say academic integrity, plagiarism in particular, has nothing to do with morality. You can plagiarize and still be a good person because it's an academic literacies issue and skill development issue. So if we provide you with the right skills, then you won't plagiarize. And when I talk with Canadians in general about where would you sit in this camp, they're like, somewhere in the middle. Depends on the day. Maybe it's both. And that as Canadians, we might take a more moderated view rather than polarized view. I noted some of the main scholars on the screen there who are prominent in these different camps in the US. One of them was a fellow by the name of Don McCabe, considered a grandfather of academic integrity in the United States, passed away in 2016. He worked at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and just across the state line in Syracuse University was the so-called sort of leader of the other camp, one by the name of Rebecca Moore Howard, one of the great plagiarism scholars. And the two of them never worked together, never collaborated. And having had a conversation with Becky Moore Howard, she said they never so much really as had a conversation. They were both working in different ways on the same topic. So I would like to suggest that the differences in opinions and dialogue is a good thing, and building the tolerance for how others in your department might think could also be a good thing. But it also sort of led to some work here in Canada, thinking about what are our Canadian ways of addressing academic integrity, and how might this be framed? So I wanted to share this framework from a colleague at the University of Calgary. It's a project that she did. It's an open access project on Indigenous academic integrity. Kita Gladue is the name of the woman who did the project. She finds her roots in the Sucker Creek Cree Nation and the Métis Nation of Manitoba. So she situated this work within Treaty 7 territory where she works with us in Calgary. But she came up with this framework and thinking about 3 principles from an Indigenous lens that could be applied, and drawing here from Indigenous scholars in particular. She talks about relationality, I am, because you are, drawing here from Wilson's work, saying that relationships don't merely shape reality, They are reality. And I should point out that the iconography that you see on your screen was created by Kita. It's her original artwork, and this is a braid signifying the ways in which we're all intertwined. In the next piece, we see reciprocity here with the hoops, and she says the roles that we serve are inherent in this commitment to the people as an understanding of the reciprocity of life and accountability to one another. This is a very different framing than students should know the rules, that we are accountable to one another. And what does that mean? And the final piece is respect. And the diamonds here represent patches on a blanket. And here she draws from Smith's work. Smith's work. She talks about Indigenous knowledge extending beyond the environment. And knowledge has values and principles of human behavior and ethics, about relationships, about wellness, and leading a good life. And here is the crux for me. She said that knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. Again, a very different framing from students must respect the rules, and if they don't, they will be punished. This has led for me for some work around decolonizing academic integrity, and what might that look like? So a question I would offer to you to ponder throughout the day is, what does it look like for you to teach with integrity and for your students to learn with integrity? It'll be different for each of us and different on the discipline. But I would challenge and say, perhaps there is more to it than simply following the rules. So that was a little bit of setting the stage. Let's go to some research findings now to help frame the conversation in an evidence-based way. I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that we've done at the University of Calgary, policy studies, and looking at some empirical research. The first one was pre-COVID, or we finished it during COVID. It was a policy analysis of academic misconduct policies across the country. We looked at 160 documents from 96 different institutions, including some from Atlantic Canadian universities, and we found some commonalities through them. Again, this was mostly before ChatGPT came on the scene. But I can tell you that most of what we found in our policy documents across Canada was very punitive language, really based on a crime and punishment approach to academic cheating. If you do this, this is the consequence or the punishment. We found the punitive approach rooted mainly in administrative law, that the sanctions should be fair, as decided by an administrator, and fit the offense, and that there were progressive discipline models. Second and subsequent offenses got harsher punishments. These are relatively easy to track from an administrative point of view. Almost what you would call a classic way of addressing misconduct. Layered onto that, some universities also added an educative approach. Rehabilitative workshops to provide additional skill building for students, paraphrasing workshops, citing and referencing workshops, providing the opportunities for students to learn. We didn't find any university that had only this approach. It was usually layered on. But the purpose often was seeking to reduce repeat offenses. Relatively easy to track, numbers of workshops, numbers of students taking workshops, numbers of repeat offenders among those who had taken the workshops, etc., etc. Again, an administrative outcome was considered desirable here. A couple of universities in Canada, mostly teaching universities, with MacEwan University sort of being an exemplar of excellence, taking a restorative resolution approach. Restorative justice doesn't apply in all cases, that the individual has to be willing to take responsibility for the offense, but the approach is seeking to repair harm with a focus on community building and long-term relationships. It can be time intensive, and it is administratively messy to track because we never know what is necessarily the outcome of this. And when MacEwan University uses this as their first line of response to an academic misconduct, they also have trained not one or two, but more than 50 academic staff members in holding restorative conferences with students. So a weakness to this approach is if there's only one or two people at the institution who are trained and responsible, those people go on leave or are no longer able to work for some reason, then the project falls apart. And since MacEwan started this in Edmonton, now I've seen other smaller teaching universities take it on. So Kwantlen Polytechnic is another example in BC. And they're showing that for them, building in relationality has been a useful way to address misconduct, particularly when there's a fair amount of research showing that when students cheat the first time, about 80 or 90% will never do it again. And so those restorative responses could be one way forward. They don't necessarily work in the cases of what we would call in my world the serial cheater. So if someone cheats again and again and again and was not willing to take responsibility, this won't really help. We found largely that we take a one-size-fits-all approach in Canada when it comes to academic misconduct. So there's usually a list of policies, list of definitions about cheating, plagiarism, cheating, etc., and a list of possible punishments, outcomes, or consequences. We don't really take into account equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, or other forms of equity-deserving factors that could help our students. And there was almost no recognition of the TRC calls to action, decolonization, or indigenization. So one of the questions I like to pose is, if we say, as educators and administrators, if we say that we care about decolonization and we haven't thought about how to decolonize plagiarism, what are we waiting for? Because thinking about the ways in which colonialism has perpetuated violence in residential schools and other contexts leads us to draw these parallels of when it comes to student conduct, we still maintain this idea of discipline and punish as a first line of action. So as you go forward in thinking about academic integrity in teaching and learning, that's one thing I'd love to leave you with today, is around thinking about how do you decolonize academic integrity. So from that led to some additional work around future-proofing integrity in the age of AI. Thinking about what does it mean as artificial intelligence adds yet another layer of complexity after we consider decolonization, after we've lived through COVID-19. And so this article is sort of pulls together some of that work. And the subsequent one was one I did with a colleague, is now at the University of Deakin, and he and I looked at assessment accommodation policies across Canada. And through those is a discourse of cheating. Most academic accommodation policies are really about preventing cheating rather than helping students learn. And a subtext there of this is how we stop students who require accommodations from cheating, and that somehow, if students have accommodation, they might just be looking for an additional way to get a leg up. So that was another policy piece layered onto this. In other words, when we think about academic integrity today, we can't really disentangle it from decolonization or EDIA. There's not a lot of time to talk about all of that today. But let's get to some of the pieces around artificial intelligence. This is work that I did with a colleague of mine at University of Calgary, Suresh Sabagan. We talked with graduate students about how they use AI, how they want to use AI, and how we can support them. Now, I will just start by laying the groundwork and saying I understand this was qualitative research and limited because we only talked to a small number of grad students. But basically, we wanted to understand how they perceive the impact of using Gen AI research applications. So my colleague Sabagan, he created an app, he writes Python, so he created an app that we tested with these students. What we found out from a small number of grad students was, well, they had fears about if they used Gen AI, would they be called up for cheating? It was a deterrent to some of the students. They were cautious about it. They had varying levels of willingness and comfort. So from this, even with a small scale study, we could see that students were not homogeneous and they wanted different things. So we had people who were super keen and others who were conscientious objectors. And that we know that the relationship between academic integrity and Gen AI is not really a simple dichotomy, but it's really evolving. And we found this in our research a couple of years ago, and I would say it's still true today. We also found out that our grad students were still interested in having work that reflected them and who they are. They were still figuring out what we would call their authorial voice. They didn't really know what their voice was. They were still developing it. But they wanted to personalize the results of Gen AI so it still sounded like them, and that they knew that they would have to evaluate the output of the Gen AI in order to be able to revise it. So there was an idea of, I have to get this output and then evaluate it in order to be able to change it. So they saw it as a co-creation or co-labor, collaboration with Gen AI. And then they looked at Gen AI as a lever towards helping them produce original work, and also helping them a little bit with things like imposter syndrome and building their confidence. So these were interesting findings for us, and the students themselves also talked about previously perspectives they hadn't considered, so using Gen AI to provide opposite ways of thinking about an argument. So before I get into the next one, next piece here about the next project that I did, I want to tell you a story about a doctoral student that I worked with about a week before I got here. He was doing his PhD candidacy, so for us is a 2-hour oral exam on his research proposal. And it's with a panel, so I was a student supervisor, there were 2 other committee members and 2 other examiners, so 5 examiners in total. The student, PhD student originally from China, excellent English. Research proposal was done very well. And when I work with my own students, I don't tell them, if you want to research about AI, I would like you to use AI. So let's do it together. And when you come up with ways of using AI that you think I haven't thought of, share it with me. And he did. So now I'm going to share it with you. So this PhD student looked up all 5 of his examiners. Well, he knew me pretty well. Found their 5 most important papers that they'd written, say in the last, 5, 10 years, looked them up and read them. That's easy. You can do that on Google Scholar. Then he used an AI app to help him summarize the key research interests of each scholar, and then take on the persona of each person to ask him questions prior to his exam. So he had a sociology professor. So act as this sociology professor, having read these person's 5 papers, quiz me as this person. Now we have a professor from languages, so quiz me as Professor Tsai, writing based on her 5 papers, and on and on. Then he went back to the AI and said, now assume that you're the sociology professor who's just had a bad day in a car accident, so take on a hostile perspective and be an adversarial professor in my examination. He told me that he used ChatGPT as his personal tutor for 16 hours a day for the 2 weeks leading up to his exam, which I thought was excessive. But I'm not sure I studied that much for any of my comps. But by the time he got to his examination room, he had been able to not just go over the 100 most common questions that you get in a PhD comps exam, but he had personalized questions that ChatGPT had asked him, not only assuming that the professor was nice, but what if they were being adversarial or had had a bad day? I had never heard of that before. The student did really well in his exam. And when I asked him, yeah? Go ahead.
Did the student find that the questions he was asked were accurate to the personalities?
Yeah, that's exactly my next point, because I asked him, I said, so did we surprise you with any questions, right? It's one of the tips that I will often say to students, expect the unexpected. I said, did we actually manage to surprise you? And he said, yes, but not very much. And he said that I was one of the ones who gave him a curveball. And I thought, okay, so we work together pretty closely, so I can still do that. That's part of our job now. But I thought, what an innovative way for students to use AI to help them up their game. And he studied for his own exam, in his way. But that when students are using AI in these really interesting, creative ways, I'm excited about that. And I have another student who's written a custom GPT for his doctoral thesis. And he's using it to get feedback. Well, he chooses to use AI. He chooses to put his work through a pro version of ChatGPT that he has. And so he knows, okay, Eaton's a stickler for APA 7. Yes, because I studied literature and I had to go from MLA over to APA, which is a kind of intellectual trauma, right? But so, okay, I'm a stickler for APA 7, given what I study. So he took his chapters 3 and 4 from his thesis and uploaded them to his ChatGPT, along with input from APA 7 and other writing manuals and other things that he knows his prof is idiosyncratic about in my evaluation. I like curly quotation marks. I don't like straight quotation marks. I use the Oxford comma. So he took all of my idiosyncratic professorial things, all of the APA things, and I think he uploaded a couple of writing books. Copyright be damned, said the student. Okay, just get over that one. And then what he came out with was chapters 3 and 4 that were technically perfect. So when he passed it to me, he said, I want you to be able to focus on the ideas and not the technicalities. Because one of my weaknesses as a professor is I will get lost in the weeds. And I will mark up all of the technical pieces before I can get to the substance. So he took all of that away for me. And I kept looking. I'm like, gosh, it's something. There's got to be something here. And there wasn't. So I was just able to comment on the ideas. That was a student using GPT in a way that they had come up with, not in a way that I would have asked, because I won't ask them to violate copyright and upload things like writing books to that. So there are some tensions there with how students are using it that I may or may not agree with. But nevertheless, what I want them to do is be open with me, because I'm learning from them how they do things. So the last research project that we worked on was, again, one at the University of Calgary. This was a mixed methods. Part 1 was quantitative. We asked 423 professors, gave them we gave them writing samples that could have been written by AI, a human, or lifted from the internet, so nobody knew, and asked them if they could correctly identify when the text was written by AI. There was about 36% accuracy rate on that one. And our studies merely confirm other findings of the same kind, that we as professors are really lousy at picking up when students have used Gen AI to write some text. And that probability might go down even more when we consider that students may take the output, refine it, edit it, make it their own, such that we don't know where the human begins and the AI ends, and vice versa. But what it does tell us is that the academic integrity arms race that's been going on for the last 30 years may be coming to an end. So if you're not familiar with this arms race, I'll walk you through it. At the top is a new technology, like the one I started with when I started teaching 30-odd years ago, the internet. And then we get excited. Some people like it, some people hate it. We have to deal with it, all kinds of different emotional responses. And at the same time, we're being called upon with teaching, learning, and assessment to figure out this new technology. And as we're doing that for teaching and learning, students are doing it for themselves. And members of the public are also figuring out the new technology, how to use it and how to misuse it. But then we can enter into the red era, where we get these companies that I like to call anti-cheating companies, anti-cheating technology companies. I won't mention any in particular. You may be familiar with some. But they tell us that they have things like plagiarism detection software. No such thing, by the way. It's text matching software. A diagnosis of plagiarism is made by a human. But they tell us if we just license their software, they will solve the misconduct problem for us. These companies have been around for 30 years, and at no university have rates of misconduct gone down. Not here, and not in other countries where use of such software is ubiquitous, like in the UK and Australia and Ireland. We don't typically use this kind of detection software in Canada, in part because there was a landmark legal case at McGill about 20 years ago where McGill tried to use Turnitin with all students. And there was a student by the name of Jesse Rosenfeld who said, "You cannot take my work, my intellectual property, and force me to surrender it to a corporate third party." McGill said, "Yes, we can." Jesse Rosenfeld said, "I'll see you in court." And the courts found in favor of the student. And that's the reason in Canada we don't use plagiarism detection software, because we had a legal precedent. But nevertheless, thinking about the millions and millions and billions of dollars that these various companies make on the promise that if we use their software, they will solve the problem. In part, they fail because our students are smart and they will get on social media and YouTube and Reddit and they will find hacks and workarounds until the next iteration of technology comes around and we start the cycle again. And when it comes to so-called plagiarism detection or AI text detectors, there are lots of conversations in my world about false positives and false negatives with this one. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the work of Jose Antonio Bowen. He just posted on LinkedIn this week, what is your tolerance level for collateral damage, was what he used. Collateral damage with students for false positives from AI text detectors. How many students are we willing to sacrifice for the false positives? It's an interesting way to frame the question, because each tool has differences and variations in sensitivity and specificity. In other words, the same text run through 5 different AI text detectors gets 5 different results. Once that text is paraphrased, machine translated, human edited, then the efficacy diminishes. And there's some additional work been done with English language learners to show their work may be flagged more than native speakers. And additionally, some interesting work by a woman named Whitney Gegg Harrison. And she works with another colleague, Claire Quarterman. They are both neurodivergent. They have taken writing samples that they physically witnessed being written by other neurodivergent individuals, ran it through AI text detection tools. Now, Whitney Gegg Harrison is a computational linguist, with the results coming back as 100% flagged as the text haven't been written by AI. Why is that? Open to debate and speculation, but it's enough to raise questions about the ways in which these tools may further perpetuate discrimination against English language learners and neurodivergent individuals. So what I like to say is that academic detection cheating software will always fail because cheating is not a technology problem, it is a human one. So in the next section that we have today, kind of looking at the big question, well, what should we do about all of this? Well, as an academic integrity scholar, I say, well, let's stop looking for evidence of cheating and look for evidence of learning. So some guiding questions, because I don't have answers for you, is what does quality look like in your discipline? What are the skills and competencies and knowledge that show a mastery of a subject area? And how do we have assessments that help students showcase their learning? I can tell you that in the last couple of years, I've done things in my classes. I have the privilege of some smaller classes, so I'm using oral exams. I have certain classes where students are required to do a term paper because it's part of a professional portfolio that they must submit at the end of their program. Otherwise, I would do away with papers. But I don't just assign them a paper, that they have one-on-one conferences with me about what they're going to talk about, and we look at drafts together, and I will have the students as well look at each other's work. None of these are foolproof, but I think one of the challenges we have as professors, that we've had as students, is that since we were students, we have learned to venerate perfection. But AI can create perfection. So now when I work with my own students, I tell them, I don't care if it's perfect. I want to see your process. And if it's messy, don't worry about it. It's okay. But to try and get over that for myself as a professor has been really hard, because it's not how I was taught as a student, and it's certainly not how I spent the first 30 years of my teaching career learning to assess students. But I'm trying to learn now to look at their process and their messiness and their failure, and that failure is part of learning, and trying not to venerate perfection. When I work with my own students, I am thinking about augmenting excellence and the ways in which we can have students show that the work that they've done by themselves might get them here, that maybe the work that AI could do could get them here. And when the student and AI work together, like my Chinese student who had his mock examiners be ChatGPT, together they can get there. That's the thing that I'm working on now as a professor and how I'm designing my assessments for my upcoming courses. Because in academic integrity, instead of taking an adversarial or antagonistic response where it's us against the students or us hunting down cheating, we can instead put the student at the center of everything we do. Doesn't mean that we absolve them of a responsibility to learn honestly and ethically. It's not about saying cheating doesn't matter anymore, but rather looking at what are our responsibilities as educators? How can the administration take part in this as academic integrity partners? There was a recent report this week, I haven't read it all yet, out of Wonk HE in the UK, and they did a survey with students over there. And the through line there was that in the UK, in their research, students felt that their universities were failing them because of a lack of clear policies, and that they could go to 5 different classes and have 5 different experiences with 5 different professors, and there was no continuity with AI. And there was very little discussion of how AI could be used for the students who had accommodations. So what caught my attention with all of that was this idea of institutions failing their students around this. Certainly we don't have all the answers. But thinking of a wraparound approach to academic integrity could be a useful way of reframing things. So I'll end today with sort of going back to this idea of our new stark reality. And instead of just thinking about what ChatGPT said, I can say that the pace of AI-generated academic and research output is unprecedented. And in a time span shorter than this presentation, AI could have generated volumes of academic content that would have taken us years to produce. And in the work I'm doing now around what I call it post-plagiarism, we can outsource some of all of our work. What we don't outsource is responsibility. For us as humans, we remain accountable. Our students remain accountable to us, and we remain accountable to them. But how we respond today will help to define the future of higher education for tomorrow. So I'll leave you with this as a thought to help frame the rest of our day. I look forward to joining you in the other sessions.